Okay, so a warm welcome to everybody to our first panel for today, entitled Work in Global Platform Capitalism. My name is Peter and I will be chairing this panel, and I would like to formally welcome our three speakers for the panel, for the first panel. So Julieta Haidar from the Workers' Innovation Center, Argentina, Martin Kuhne from IS Institute at the University of Amsterdam, Netherlands, and Janina Berg from the ILO, International Labour Organization. So yeah, I would just like to kindly remind our speakers to stick to the time, so 10 minutes each for presentation. Unfortunately, since we are online, the only way for me to give reminders is to rudely interrupt you before you finish. So take that as a cue to round up your presentation. After the three presentations, we'll have 15 minutes for questions and discussion. So I'd also kindly like to ask our audience to save their questions for those 15 minutes. So without further ado, Julieta, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Muchas gracias, Peter. Bueno, yo tengo la responsabilidad de abrir este webinar y esta sesión. Entonces es por eso que me gustaría hacer más una presentación introductoria respecto del trabajo de plataformas, ¿no? Y cómo estudiarlo. Sabiendo sobre todo que es un tema de gran actualidad y además que tiene perspectivas de extenderse, sobre todo en un contexto de pandemia, donde todas las relaciones sociales se han digitalizado, también por supuesto el trabajo, y a nosotros nos interesa particularmente pensar el trabajo de plataformas que, digo algo muy sencillo, refieren a esas empresas que hacen la intermediación entre consumidores, proveedores, trabajadores, y que esa intermediación y estas empresas está basada en la negación de vínculos laborales y en la precariedad de los trabajadores. Este fenómeno, que como decíamos es un fenómeno global, ha sido estudiado atendiendo en particular a ciertos aspectos, que un poco yo los organizaría teniendo en cuenta las disciplinas desde las cuales se estudió, ¿no? Por una parte, sobre todo desde la sociología del trabajo y las relaciones laborales, se han estudiado temas vinculados a condiciones de trabajo, a las dinámicas de control y resistencia de las y los trabajadores. Y desde el derecho del trabajo, otra línea con mucha fortaleza para estudiar estos temas, se discute sobre todo la naturaleza de las plataformas, este debate de si son proveedoras de servicios o intermediarias tecnológicas, y los vínculos con los trabajadores, si son autoempleados o subordinados, y cuáles pueden ser posibles marcos regulatorios. Ahora, a esta caracterización, a mí me interesa agregar también otro elemento que es pertinente en este webinar, que es que en general, por supuesto no es la totalidad, prima para estudiar este tema una epistemología del norte global, ¿no? Ciertos problemas y ciertos modos de pensarlos desde países del norte que en general se universalizan hacia el resto de las geografías. Como ejemplo, la precarización como novedad, la erosión de las instituciones del estado de bienestar, cuando en países del sur global la precariedad es un rasgo estructural, dadas sociedades altamente heterogéneas y fragmentadas, y el estado de bienestar nunca tuvo las características que ha tenido en los países al menos de Europa Central. Entonces hay que marcar algunos matices a la hora también de hacer la investigación sobre el trabajo de plataformas. Mi propuesta concreta es estos diferentes abordajes, vincularlos, establecer articulaciones, integrar las distintas dimensiones para pensar el trabajo de plataformas, no porque para tener un paper más completo, ¿no? Donde trate todas las dimensiones, pero fundamentalmente porque es necesario pensarlo de este modo, porque las plataformas funcionan a partir de la articulación de distintas dimensiones que son necesarias, que se retroalimentan, que son interdependientes, ¿no? Una dimensión que yo llamo más de tipo tecnológico-organizativa, una dimensión institucional o normativa, y una dimensión más de tipo cultural o ideológica. algunos elementos centrales de cada una de estas dimensiones y de cómo puede haber en cada una de estas dimensiones ciertas especificidades de acuerdo a las geografías en las que se enraizan estas plataformas. En primer lugar, con respecto a la cuestión, a la dimensión más tecnológica, organizativa, habitualmente esto uno lo puede sintetizar en términos de lo que es la gestión algorítmica, que ha sido definida como una forma de gestionar la fuerza de trabajo. Aquí yo agregaría que no es solo eso, no es solo una forma más, entre otras que existen en el management de gestionar, ¿no?, la fuerza de trabajo, sino como una forma de organizar el proceso de la producción y el trabajo en sí mismo. Decisiones algorítmicas que definen de fondo cuestiones de tarifa, bonificaciones, procedimientos, organización de jornadas. Y aquí, en relación a la cuestión geográfica, esto se ve sobre todo más fuerte en las plataformas de trabajo online, donde los clientes y los trabajadores se ubican en distintos países. Esto está bastante estudiado, entiendo que Marten y Janine seguramente ahondarán en esto, pero la idea de clientes del norte y trabajadores del sur, y que esto tiene incidencia a la hora de ver cuáles son las tarifas, los horarios de trabajo y demás. En términos más de tipo normativos e institucionales, esto es ampliamente conocido, que las plataformas se caracterizan por desconocer la existencia de vínculos laborales, que sustituyen los contratos de trabajo por acuerdos de términos de servicios, y esto significa para los trabajadores altos niveles de incertidumbre, de inestabilidad, de precariedad. Se trata del problema que puede ser enunciado como la remercantilización de la fuerza de trabajo, ¿no? Nuevamente, en términos geográficos, aquí esta dimensión más de tipo institucional, normativa, es la que más ha meritado reflexiones sobre diferencias geográficas, ¿no? Sabiendo que las plataformas tienen que vincularse con marcos institucionales, con actores locales. Y esto yo agregaría, retomando lo que decía antes, que en el sur no ha habido una plena desmercantilización de la fuerza de trabajo, ¿no?, antes de los años 80 o incluso 70, ¿no? Hay una precariedad que se agrega a la preexistente, como capas de precariedad. A esa precariedad estructural se agrega ahora la precariedad del trabajo de plataformas. Y ahora sí, la última dimensión, que es fundamental, que a mí me resulta la más atractiva quizás porque es la que menos se trabaja, es una dimensión de tipo más cultural e ideológica, y acá decir que las plataformas apelan a la figura del emprendedor de sí, una figura que se basa en el deseo de mayor autonomía, realización personal, trabajo no alienado, que era por otra parte también el anhelo del mayo francés, del movimiento libertario contra la alienación, y que hoy se traduce en la subsunción de todos los aspectos de la vida al trabajo. Esto concretamente en las plataformas se traduce en la propuesta de se gana según el esfuerzo, se gana según las capacidades, según el empeño. Decir que en términos geográficos esto se refuerza en países del sur global, donde hay una idea de que es posible autonomizarse no solo de jefaturas, ¿no?, soy mi propio jefe, sino también hay un anhelo, una expectativa de independizarse de determinaciones políticas y económicas más amplias. La idea de que a través del esfuerzo individual uno puede eludir la desocupación y la pobreza que caracteriza a un país en particular. Entonces vemos cómo estas tres dimensiones se articulan, y por eso digo que son necesarias, cómo desde cada una de ellas se aporta al sostenimiento, inclusive también a la legitimación de estas empresas de plataformas. Tenemos, en términos tecnológicos organizativos, algoritmos que marcan ciertas metas que el trabajador debe alcanzar, desde la dimensión más normativa, la inexistencia de contratos laborales y la firma de acuerdos entre partes supuestamente iguales, o más que firma, adhesión de los trabajadores a esos acuerdos, y el discurso de no tener jefes, de ser autónomos. Entonces lo que vemos, y con esto cierro, es una configuración compleja donde las relaciones de poder entre trabajadores y plataformas son muy desiguales, y que por tanto entiendo que también hay que ser cuidadosos a la hora de ver qué respuesta darles, ¿no? Sobre algunos de estos puntos se van a reflexionar, entiendo, más en el panel 3 de este webinar, ¿no? Pero sobre todo pensando en las regulaciones y las expectativas que generan soluciones regulatorias, tener en cuenta que regulaciones genéricas e imprecisas pueden ser insuficientes ante la gran versatilidad de las plataformas. Entonces, plataformas con algoritmos que rápidamente cambien las condiciones y que reproduzcan o intensifiquen la precariedad, y al mismo tiempo tener en cuenta también que regulaciones, si se quieren, más tradicionales, con pautas fijas sobre organización de jornadas y salarios, pueden ir también a contramano de los anhelos de libertad de los trabajadores, de autonomía y libertad, que son fundamentales para estos trabajadores. Entonces la propuesta, un poco, más como pregunta, y efectivamente más como propuesta que como algo resuelto, es abordar el tema en su complejidad y tratar también de construir respuestas integrales, articuladas y también complejas. Hasta ahí, muchas gracias la presentación. Gracias, Petar.
Thank you very much, Julieta, and thank you very much for being perfectly on time with your presentation. I'm sure it's a good start for our panel and for the discussion afterwards. So our next speaker is Martin. Martin, the floor is yours.
You would need to unmute.
Yes, I'll try to be as good a student as Julieta and stick to my 10 minutes as well. So in my brief presentation, I drawn an introduction of a book that Julieta and myself have been editing, and that will be published by Edward Elgar and the ILO later this year. It's a book called Work and Labor Relations in Global Platform Capitalism. And in this book, we focus on, let's say, what is happening with labor platforms around the world. Basically, we have contributions from different continents, from different disciplines, sort of fairly comprehensive book, we hope, at least. Now, for today, I pick a small part of the introduction, which is relevant for today's discussion. I just put in the chat a link to the introduction that I just mentioned. For those who want to see the whole introduction, you can also find there an outline of the book, what it's going to look like. Today, we're talking about Global North and Global South and the role that labor platforms have in here. But first of all, we sort of start from the assumption that labor platforms are, let's say, the sort of the next phase of capitalist development, capitalism as a mode of production that continuously tries to sort of optimize the way it organizes work, combining new technologies with its own organizational, managerial, and also discursive strategies, in line with what Julieta just said. And this includes, if we talk about North and South, this includes the how can we say this, the next level in the fragmentation of economic activity. So we've already had decades in which we see that companies more and more split up their activities, outsource offshore activities, trying to optimize their global value chains. And we could argue that labor platforms, and especially the online ones, are the sort of the next level in here, because they facilitate the outsourcing of more and more activities, mainly service activities, not so much to what we were used to other companies in other countries, but rather to an enormous group of individuals that is competing with each other for the work that is being outsourced. And this, in terms of North and South, creates a new division of labor. We get a new division of labor between North and South. This is especially true for the online platforms. In a way, we can also, the offline platforms, the deliveries and the taxis and the cleaners, also there we can see them in the light of a new division of labor internationally. But in this case, the offline platforms, it's not so much the work that crosses borders, but it's the workers. So we see that often it is migrant workers who perform the work. And in that sense, we can also there talk about a new division of labor. And in the next session, we will have more on this migrant dimension of platform work. Now, how can we understand this new division of labor, and what can we think of? How can we think of it? And we've identified in our introduction of this book, we've identified two quite distinct, but in a way not mutually exclusive perspectives. One focusing on exploitation, and the other one's focusing more on opportunities. Now, the exploitation perspective basically argues that it starts from the observation that most of the online labor platforms are financed by capital from the North. Most of the demand for labor, that means most of the clients are located in the global North, but most of the work is done by workers in the global South. Now, first first observation there is that this then may create new forms of dependency of the South on Northern capital, and also on the, let's say, on the whims of Northern capital. What they decide to do has strong effects on the workers in the South. And we can see in a way that then workers in the South become, under this exploitation perspective, they become digitally subordinated to capital and clients in the North. Now, this new division of labor is quite curious from a historical perspective, as some of the authors in our book notice. They call it a sort of a new international putting out system of labor, where historically we've seen a movement of work from the household or from home-based workshops to factories, to offices, to organizations. These platforms, in a way, reverse this trend. The online platforms, they bring work back to the home of the worker, and in that sense, in a way, first of all, reversing a historical trend, which is in itself interesting to observe. But also, by doing so, they allow the clients from the North to make enormous savings in terms of labor costs, in terms of management, in terms of real estate, in terms of equipment, and in terms of the entrepreneurial risk. And all these costs and risks are, through these platforms, in a way, put on the shoulders of some Southern workers. Still, from this exploitation perspective, we can see that workers in the South often earn less than workers in the North, even if they have the same qualifications and do the same work. And they suffer from what the colleagues from the Oxford Internet Institute in our book call liabilities of origin, meaning that clients in the North simply expect workers in the South to earn less and to accept less. And they are often forced to accept less, also because for them, platform work is more often their main source of income, while in the North, platform workers often have this as an additional source of income, which sort of changes the dynamics and the power relationships. And on top of this, as was especially described in the chapter we have on China and India, there is lots of discriminatory language, discriminatory treatment from workers from the South by clients from the North. So that is let's say what we can say the negative or the exploitative perspective. The opportunities perspective is, per definition, much more positive, and it rather sees online platforms as offering workers and countries in the South important opportunities to make good use of Northern capital. it's often seen as a good way by governments, for example, as a good way to strengthen the economy, to strengthen the labor markets. And they argue that it's an important source of income and an important way to reduce outward migration or brain drain, as I sometimes call it, because it creates opportunities at home. They also argue that it can actually reduce the need for foreign investment, which often comes with a lot of conditions, with a lot of things you have to give in, and that is then seen as a positive way. Also, platform workers in the South are often, let's say, considerably positive about platform work. For the more highly skilled, it often offers them more or better earning opportunities than the local labor market does. And they are also often very, we see this in the surveys and in interviews, they are very positive about the flexibility and the autonomy that this work offers. We spent some time in our book discussing how real or fictitious this type of autonomy is, but for them it's an important factor which should not be underestimated. Now, how do we look at these two different views? And then, Peter, I will finish, so I will more or less stick to my 10. We think that these perspectives both have a lot of truth in there, and both are useful perspectives to look at platform work and to look at the relationships north and south. And they simply show that these relationships are complicated, that they are full of tensions, that they are not very easily simply characterized. And we can say online platforms are largely populated by workers from the south, but managed by capital from the north, and therefore we see exploitation, dependency, inequalities, and discrimination. But at the same time, they offer workers from the south certain earning, learning, and autonomy opportunities that they may lack in the local labor markets, which is the condition in which they live. And these opportunities are the reason that workers often express their satisfaction with this type of work, even when they are perfectly aware of its exploitative character. And I would like to stick to that by now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin, for your interesting contribution and for sticking to the time. And finally, our last speaker in this panel is Janine Berg, who has started her presentation, so I give the word to her now.
Bueno, buenos días y buenas tardes. Muchas gracias por la invitación a Julieta y a Martín. Martín habló un poco del libro que se va a publicar este año, lo que yo estoy presentando es un capítulo que escribí con mi colega Umarani para ese libro y también un poco más de información que hemos hecho sobre este tema en los últimos años. Bueno, nuestro capítulo, a ver si puedo, sí, ok. Mi presentación se concentra en las plataformas en línea, así que no me voy a preocupar con las plataformas locales. Para nosotros en la OIT, esta evolución de trabajo en plataformas en línea es muy interesante, por varias razones, pero especialmente por el tema de la regulación, dado el hecho de que la plataforma puede estar ubicada en los Estados Unidos, el cliente en Alemania y el trabajador en cualquier sitio. Y en términos de regulación, eso impone grandes desafíos para el mundo de trabajo. Pero también es interesante porque en mi propia opinión, yo creo que significa también que hay mucha potencial realmente en términos de crecimiento en este tipo de trabajo. Nosotros nos hemos concentrado más que nada en las plataformas de microtareas y un poco las plataformas de freelance, pero es cierto que se ha evolucionado en otros aspectos. Aquí, por ejemplo, tengo esta foto que viene de una plataforma, que es una plataforma virtual esencialmente de asistentes, secretarias. Es una empresa australiana que contrata a trabajadores en las Filipinas para hacer ese tipo de trabajo. Así que yo pienso personalmente que habrá mucho más de ese tipo de crecimiento en los próximos años. Bueno, nosotros hicimos en la OIT una encuesta inicial en 2015 sobre 2 plataformas de microtareas y después en 2017 agregamos 3 más y rehicimos la encuesta. Así que al total tuvimos 3.000 trabajadores encuestados que trabajan sobre estas plataformas de microtareas. Y yo, bueno, no tengo mucho tiempo solamente voy a destacar algunos hallazgos importantes. Uno que es bien importante de considerar en todo este debate sobre si es algo positivo o no para la gente, y especialmente para la gente en los países en desarrollo, es que realmente este mano de obra es una mano de obra muy calificada. Vemos que en el sur, por ejemplo, 45% de la gente tenían ya estudios universitarios completos y muchos también que estaban actualmente haciendo su curso y también muchos otros con másters o doctorado. Así que en India, por ejemplo, ya más del 70% de los trabajadores tenían por lo menos estudios universitarios. Comparando un poco las razones para no trabajar más, porque mucha gente quería trabajar más horas, así que teníamos algunas preguntas sobre por qué no están trabajando más horas. Y lo que es interesante destacar aquí comparando, estos son hombres en el norte, mujeres en el norte, hombres en el sur, mujeres en el sur. Vemos, las razones son casi similares, pero hay dos pequeñas diferencias. El primero es una de las preguntas ofrecidas era si el pago era suficiente. Y tenemos a 20 o más 23% de los hombres en el norte diciendo que el pago no es suficiente y por eso no estaban realizando más trabajo, pero en el sur ese número era menor. Y bueno, obviamente eso tiene que ver un poco con la diferencia en los niveles de ingresos del sur y el norte. Pero también había una diferencia en el porcentaje de personas que respondieron que no tenían las cualificaciones necesarias para hacer el trabajo. Y eso tiene que ver un poco a veces con las cualificaciones, pero en muchos casos es porque la gente en los países en desarrollo, como son plataformas del norte, a veces no habían tareas que eran que no estaban ofrecidas a gente que vivían en el sur, a veces por razones culturales, porque tenían que escribir algo y tenían que conocer un poco la cultura en ese caso, de Estados Unidos, por ejemplo, pero también en muchos casos había mucha gente que pensaban que esto era más bien discriminatorio. Bueno, comparando los ingresos, porque esto, bueno, siempre es un tema bien importante. Aquí, solamente para comparar la plataforma Amazon Mechanical Turk, los trabajadores indios con los trabajadores norteamericanos, y se nota aquí que, aquí del lado izquierda, que los americanos ganaban el doble que los indios. Y esto también está muy vinculado con el hecho de que no están ofrecidos las mismas tareas. Sin embargo, cuando se ajusten las remuneraciones, los ingresos para la paridad de poder adquisitivo, vemos que en el caso de la India están ganando más que los americanos. Así que, por ejemplo, bueno, aquí 2017, $8 por hora comparado con $6 por hora en los Estados Unidos. Así que hay que tomar eso en cuenta cuando se hace estas comparaciones. Pero ahora quería ofrecerles este otro dato que es interesante, y esto viene de un capítulo que hicimos para un otro artículo que hemos escrito comparando las condiciones de trabajo de los trabajadores indios, comparando trabajadores muy parecidos. A ver, un trabajador indio que en el mismo sector, pero trabajando no en línea, y el otro trabajando en la plataforma de microtareas, solamente para comparar un poco las remuneraciones. Y lo que vemos es que un trabajador similar, con mismo nivel educativo, mismo sector, ocupación ocupación parecido, ganaba mucho más, bueno, no mucho más, pero ganaba $1.50 más por hora si estaba trabajando fuera de línea que si estuviese trabajando en la plataforma de microtareas. Martín habló un poco de este nuevo tipo de tercerización, y para mí lo que hemos visto es eso, porque lo que en la foto en la mano izquierda, aquí tenemos un típico como call center en la India, y es una gran diferencia entre entre estas dos modalidades de trabajo. La persona que estaba trabajando para un call center tenía un contrato formal, tenía colegas, tenía los derechos y los beneficios que ese contrato formal le ofrecía. El trabajador trabajando para la plataforma tiene la ventaja de poder trabajar desde su casa, pero no tiene el beneficio bueno, no tiene los mismos beneficios, por ejemplo, si hay aguinaldos o otros beneficios, no tiene las mismas protecciones en términos de protección de trabajo, porque bueno, no está considerado como un asalariado, y sin embargo están ganando menos según las estimaciones que hicimos. También hay que destacar, y esto es un hecho muy importante, es que hay mucha competencia entre los trabajadores para este trabajo, y eso significa que siempre habrá presión en los salarios. Estos datos vienen de Upwork, que es una plataforma de freelance, pero solamente les quería mostrar, por ejemplo, que aunque habían más de 2 millones de personas inscritas en esa plataforma, solamente 189,000 habían ganado más que $1 en la plataforma. O sea, solamente 8% de la gente inscrita habían ganado dinero, y en la gente que realmente pueden ganarse un buen salario en esa plataforma es muy limitada, lo cual significa que siempre habrá esa presión. Y también el otro hecho es que, como le mencioné anteriormente, que como son trabajadores geográficamente dispersos trabajando para plataformas ubicadas en otros países, significa que siempre va a ser muy difícil para reclamar derechos o para resolver disputas. Así que si un país decide, por ejemplo, que quieren proteger a estos trabajadores, le va a significar que para ese país tendrá un sesgo anticompetitivo para ese país. Y la única manera realmente de resolver esa situación es de tener un tipo de reglamentación o gobernanza, vamos a decir mejor, al nivel internacional. Algo que se podría una gobernanza por lo menos que le ayudaría al trabajador de reclamar algunas disputas, por ejemplo, si no le habían pagado o si tenía un otro tipo de problema. Así que no hay mucho por hacer en este tema, y bueno, eso es todo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Janina, for this concise and very informative presentation as well. I would now like to give the floor to our audience for questions, comments, and suggestions for discussion. And I would like to kindly remind you to use the chat function for this, because there's a lot of people and it will be easier and useful for all of us. Thank you. Any questions? If not, then maybe I will kickstart a discussion with a general question for Martin and for Julieta, first of all, but for all others who also think that they might be able to answer. You started a little bit with describing this as sort of a new phase in the development of capitalism, and you try to link it with some of the earlier tendencies that we had and that you have seen. But what do you think, and what would you say, how seriously should we take this as another phase of development of capitalism? And because there are different views that might argue that this is maybe simply a short-term, fashionable type of business model, which isn't very sustainable, and in a couple of years we'll just stop talking about it. There are also views that this is a completely new phase. So where do you stand on this debate, and what would you comment on that?
Should I say something on this?
Yes, please. Thank you.
So I think it's a bit hard to predict if this is a new phase or if it will disappear in the future. I think that the most important really thing to emphasize is that platforms are not an isolated development. They're not a technology-driven development, but it can only be understood as part of the broader development of capitalism, I think. And rather than a new phase, for me, first of all, it represents a new, a further intensification of trends that were already ongoing before platforms came on our agenda. And then I think of this process of optimizing labor processes, at least optimizing labor processes from the perspective of management and from investors. Then I think of this process of commodifying and recommodifying ever more activities in our societies. Then I think of this process of fragmentation that I talked about. And I think the platforms that we see now are, first of all, really a continuity of this process, and in that sense, a new step or the frontier of this type of process. If it's a business model with a long future, I'm not so sure. And most of the platforms seem to be fairly shaky in terms of profit making. At the same time, they attract enormous amounts of capital, because there is so much capital around in this present phase of capitalism that capital is simply desperately looking for opportunities to invest. And there is I think, an interesting extra dimension of these platforms, that they do not only perform certain activities, but they also contribute to the accumulation of data. And there, I think many investors are interested in the future, what you can do in the future with all this data that's being accumulated about customers, about processes, about workers. And I think it's still a little bit indeterminate what we can expect to do with that in the future, but it is a thing that investors, again, because they are desperately looking for investment opportunities, are interested in. That would be my first consideration with this question.
Okay, thank you, Martin. In the meantime, we have received quite many questions in the chat box. There's a few questions for Janine. Maybe if you would like to take over. I don't know if you can see the chat yourself, or if I should. They're in Spanish, so it's better that I don't read it out myself. But if you want to.
Okay, should I read it out too?
Yeah.
Okay. Bueno, hay una pregunta si la OIT está incorporando el análisis de trabajo en microtareas, las afectaciones sobre la salud y estrés de las tareas repetitivas. Bueno, cuando nosotros lanzamos el cuestionario en 2015, modelamos un poco el cuestionario usando las preguntas de la encuesta europea sobre condiciones de trabajo. Así que habían y hay algunas preguntas sobre, bueno, especialmente sobre las horas de trabajo, un poco sobre satisfacción, un poco sobre la salud del trabajador. No hay tantas preguntas como cómo les afecta un poco, pero sí hemos hecho algunos grupos focales en la cual, bueno, podíamos saber un poco, entender un poco mejor la situación. Yo creo que los problemas más que nada que nosotros hemos visto es que la gente se sientan como son gestionados por un algoritmo y no tienen realmente muy poca posibilidad de intercambiar con la empresa, con el cliente que le está contratando. Hay más que nada lo que vemos es una frustración en términos de esa de no tener esa posibilidad de comunicación que le causa mucho estrés. Y en la literatura sabemos muy bien que esa falta de autonomía, la falta de control y la falta de apoyo en términos de gestión o de otros colegas es un indicador de estrés en el lugar de trabajo. Pero sin embargo no hemos escrito un poco sobre eso, pero no hemos tenido un enfoque particular sobre ese aspecto, pero yo creo que es un aspecto muy importante para este tipo de trabajo, pero también para todo el trabajo digitalizado que estamos viendo en el mundo, en los almacenes y en otros lugares de trabajo, no solamente en las plataformas. Should I continue or should we go to others now?
Peter, you're muted.
Sorry, yeah, I didn't see the last part of the translation was on. So if you could just repeat your.
Do you want me to continue with more questions or because
yes,
there's a few more, but I think I want to give the floor to Julieta and Martin also.
Yeah, we do have quite many questions now, so it's best, I guess, if we cherry pick the most interesting ones that you would like to address. So if you want to answer one more, there's also fine. You receive the most questions.
Ok, había una pregunta un poco sobre el método por la cual se establece esa comparación. Bueno, ahí es muy simple, usamos los datos de poder adquisitivo. Hay unas, yo no sé si son hechos del Fondo Monetario del Banco Mundial, pero usamos ese índice para cambiar los datos de cuánto reciben y después hicimos el análisis de cuánto eso significaría en la India. Pero sin embargo, aunque sí significa que si se hace esa comparación que están ganando más que un trabajador en el norte, bueno, estos son trabajadores americanos, estaban ganando más que un trabajador americano cuando se hacía esa recomputación. Sin embargo, no están ganando mucho y hay que tomar en cuenta de que 75% de estos trabajadores tenían estudios universitarios completos.
Thank you. We had one question which I think might be good for all of our panelists to think about, and it's from Anne, who said that these are very complex and issues with a lot of different factors on different levels. And then if you had to recommend one or two elements from these stories that we heard so far, on which policymakers could focus on, what would you recommend as sort of the key two elements? So for any of our panelists who feel like they would like to respond to this.
May I say something on this? I mean, it's of course an impossible question, just as impossible it is to describe all the complexity of the phenomenon that we are dealing with. But, so my first thing that comes to mind to me is that ultimately one would like platform workers in whatever situation to have a decent job, huh? And that first of all I think means having better regulation of how these jobs are classified, how these jobs are remunerated, how their health and safety are safeguarded, application of national laws, also implementation of national laws would be, of course, a good start. At the same time, this is a bit wishful thinking because this is not a new plan, so it is not so very easy. There are, of course, also entirely different approaches on the table these days. There's lots of workers' organizations that now show especially interest in getting to know the deeper workings of algorithms, for example, so that workers actually know how they are managed by what kind of program and by what kind of parameters they are managed as a in a sense of information as a first input. So yeah, I think that's also a very, very interesting start. But the ultimate goal, at least I think from our perspective, should be that the jobs where they are not should become of a more decent level.
Thank you, Martin. And then maybe as a final question to round off this this panel, we received also a question about the global North and global South divisions, which is also, of course, one of the topics for today. So maybe for you, Julieta, if you'd like to comment on this and the differences of what is proposed as a regulation for riders or platform workers in general in the global North and global South, and the differences in these proposals.
Sí, la pregunta que más aparece sobre un poco la respuesta, ¿qué hacer frente a esto? ¿Cómo regular? Más que nada yo entiendo que estas son cuestiones vinculadas a la intervención, sobre todo a las relaciones de fuerza entre las partes, ¿no? Empresarios, trabajadores y Estado. Acá un actor que no mencionamos que para nosotros es central son las organizaciones sindicales, ¿no? Y en esto hay experiencias a nivel global, sí hay experiencias de muchas veces resistencias o micro resistencias que a veces a mi juicio, esto es un juicio personal, son sobrevaloradas, porque son experiencias sobre todo creo que interesantes en el mediano y en el largo plazo, en lo que tiene que ver con la construcción de identidad colectiva, de identidad de trabajadores, contra esos idearios de autonomía, y es un paso primero constitutivo, fundacional de cualquier organización colectiva de trabajadores, ¿no? Pero digo sí, sobrevaloradas en lo que hace a cómo enfrentarse con las plataformas, y que muchas veces eso lleva también a la frustración de los propios trabajadores que forman esas organizaciones, ¿no? Porque hacen una medida de fuerza, un paro virtual, que tiene un resultado exitoso pero efímero, de muy corto plazo, y eso va generando luego desgaste. Entonces, a mi juicio, para la regulación desde ya se necesita la participación, el activismo indispensable de los trabajadores, pero por supuesto también la participación y la voz del Estado, que restituya estas relaciones entre trabajadores y empresas de plataformas como relaciones laborales, ¿no? En tanto se traten como partes casi idénticas de acuerdos comerciales, se va a disfrazar ese vínculo como si fueran partes iguales. Acá el lugar ineludible es el lugar, es la voz del Estado, y por supuesto lo que uno anhela siempre es llegar un poco a, entiendo que Anne y su colega en la mesa 3 nos compartirán un poco lo que queremos aprender también de la experiencia de Dinamarca y países nórdicos que haciendo estudios comparados son un poco quizás lo que más han podido avanzar en las instancias supremas de las relaciones laborales, que es la negociación colectiva entre las partes. Así que la regulación, sobre todo, como decía Martín, en relación a esto que hoy te ha denominado como trabajo decente, es darle calidad a este tipo de trabajo. Calidad que es salario y que son protecciones sociales.
¿Respondo también o no? Okay. Bueno, bueno, yo creo que el aspecto colectivo es muy importante para las plataformas locales. Yo tengo mis dudas, y aquí estoy hablando de mi parte y no de la parte de la OIT. Yo tengo mis dudas realmente de cómo se va a resolver las plataformas en línea al nivel internacional, ya que realmente la regulación del trabajo, el contrato de trabajo es algo nacional, y por tanto es este problema realmente con un mundo de trabajo globalizado, pero formas de regulación que son nacionales y que causan estos problemas. Así que si no tenemos algunas respuestas internacionales a esta pregunta, yo creo que siempre vamos a tener problemas en términos de calidad de trabajo para los trabajadores en línea.
Thank you very much. Now, given the time constraints, I propose that we end this panel now, and I'm sure a lot of these questions will come up again in the next panels as well. So a big thank you for all of our panelists, and please join me in a virtual round of applause for everyone and their questions. We have a 5-minute break, and so we will reconvene at 4 minutes past 4, please. That's European time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I will pause the recording now, and I will see you in 5 minutes.
Bueno, vamos a dar inicio a la segunda sesión que la va a presentar Lucía Bachoer, que es candidata PhD del Instituto Gino Germani de la Universidad de Buenos Aires.
Bueno, Julieta, muchas gracias. Bienvenidos a este panel de trabajo migratorio y plataformas digitales. Al igual que en el panel anterior, los expositores van a tener 10 minutos por cada exposición y después 15 minutos para que hagamos una ronda de preguntas y debates. Los expositores de este panel van a ser Niels van Dor de la Universidad de Ámsterdam, Jessica Pla del Instituto Gino Germani de la Universidad de Buenos Aires y del CONICET, María Bancheva de la Universidad de Liverpool y Tibor Mensman del Central European. ¿Quería empezar? Niels?
That means I can start, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Niels van Doorn. I lead the Platform Labor Research Project. I've been doing so since early 2018. I don't have much time to talk about the project kind of at large, but we research how platforms are transforming labor, social reproduction, and urban governance in 3 major cities, Amsterdam, in the global north, I should add, Amsterdam, Berlin, and New York City. The larger project also focuses on short-term rental and voluntary-based care in the 3rd sector. But my own research focuses on gig economy work, especially on food delivery and domestic cleaning. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this short presentation as well. In these sectors or industries, platform labor has become migrant labor. That's, of course, what we're here to talk about. And to answer why that is the case, where is that so? I think we should kind of travel back in time and offer a little bit of historical context. Because I started with saying industries, quote unquote, because we should, of course, remember that before the arrival of platform companies or the gig economy at large, there were, of course, no food delivery or domestic cleaning industries, right? These were mostly informal types of work. They were fragmented under or unregulated labor markets. And they were oftentimes both publicly and institutionally, especially, invisible. A lot of people just didn't care about this work and who did this work. It's been there for a very long time, but we should just keep that in mind, right? These jobs were never good and were always marginalized and invisibilized. Now, with platformization, you could say that platformization kind of was a industrialization then of these previously informal and unregulated forms of work. And with industrialization, I mean predominantly then kind of the intensive scaling and partial formalization and institutionalization according to platform norms and rules. But of course, without, so importing the existing problems of food delivery and domestic work, but without then, when industrializing, not having industrial relations or formalization of labor market institutions. And this is one thing that we should also keep in mind. Platforms love institutional voids. So these forms of work were never really formalized, never really regulated. So this is also a big advantage for these companies to then kind of disrupt that mode of work. So we went from a landscape of fragmented capital and fragmented labor, so restaurants and the people who work for them, in the case of food delivery, to concentrated capital that then that disrupts this and intermediates this and reorganizes these forms of work and these labor markets. So we should see platformization then also as a double movement of financialization and datafication. I don't have time to talk about datafication part. I've written about that with Adam Badger in an article in Antipode. But I want to just briefly focus on the financialization part, because finance capital, the investment of finance capital allowed, of course, for this incredible scaling and also through cross-subsidization of this work. So cross-subsidization means you could pay relatively high wages to get people on the platform, start working for you, and you could keep artificially the consumer prices low, right? So that was kind of, that first phase, if you will, was kind of the golden age. of the gig economy. A lot of people loved it. Everyone wanted to kind of work in it. This was like 2012 to 15, maybe 16. But then, of course, a lot of these companies also, especially when they went public, but even before that, they had to show a road to profitability. So they had to not only scale, but also show cost efficiencies. And of course, that then led to the even more switching to independent contracting models, especially in Europe. In the US, for instance, there was already independent contracting from the start, but in Europe, a lot of times they used employment contracts or at least subcontracting. And of course, switching to per order pay and algorithmic pricing of those orders. Now we get to the point of this kind of first half of this short presentation. What you saw then, as platforms tried to get a road to profitability going, you saw a decline in wages and working conditions and an exit of white citizens, basically, right? So there was an exit of white citizens who had alternatives, and you saw a major entrance of racialized migrants with few better options. So this is then the moment. So starting from, say, it's hard to like really date this, but say 17, 18, somewhere 2017, 18, you saw the becoming migrant of the gig worker. All right, so that's then kind of the prehistory kind of why migrant platform labor has become migrant labor, at least in the sectors that I study, food delivery and also cleaning. And now the second part of this, of what I want to say is kind of, so are we then dealing with a mutually beneficial relationship, right? A perverse, but maybe perhaps partly mutually beneficial arrangement. To what extent? Because there's definitely this idea of a platform fix, right? There are needs on several sides of the market, so to speak, and these platforms are offering their fix, kind of in the same way also as David Harvey has talked about the spatial fix, or others have talked about the financial fix. These are also kind of enrolled even in this platform fix that the platforms offer. So from the platform perspective, why work with migrants? There's an abundant labor supply and an incredible rate of substitutability. Because there's always going to be new waves of migrants who have a few opportunities and want to work. Again, from the platform perspective, migrants will, and at least they thought this in the beginning until they were proven wrong by massive migrant organizing. But in the beginning, they figured migrants will be less likely to resist or complain due to unfamiliarity with local norms, with local rules and local institutions. And to a certain extent, they are still right. But of course, they've also been proven wrong. Because migrants struggle with these, are less familiar with these rules and institutions, they are more disembedded than white citizens or the people who consider themselves white, right? And there's, of course, transience, which also works to the advantage of platform companies. Now, from the state perspective, in this mutually beneficial relationship, why are these platforms beneficial? Well, gig platforms absorb surplus, especially migrant and minority labor. We get, and this is important, without solving the problem of surplus labor or superfluity of this labor. They just download it onto the so-called market that they engineer, which is not a market according to traditional conceptions of the market, of course. And this means because they don't owe these people anything when they onboard them, they overhire. The whole market is based on, the whole business model is based on structural overhiring. So the surplus is downloaded. Then another reason for the state that is comfortable for the state that the gig economy kind of is there and the way it functions is that it, and this relates to the first point, is it eases the pressure on low-wage labor markets and on unemployment rates, and it also ameliorates kind of or lessens the necessity for reforms in these low-wage labor markets. Now, finally, from the migrant perspective, why do this work? Well, a lot of you will probably already know this, you do research on this, but in my research, what I found is that first of all, it's the best available option. As I said before, it's an easy and quick access to an income stream. Oftentimes these platforms have instant payout. Don't forget how incredibly important instant payout is. And instead of having to wait like 2 weeks or a month for your pay, there's relatively more autonomy on the job because you can log out and in whenever you want. You can decline orders when you want. You don't have a boss breathing down your neck. I mean, these things they've been criticized, of course, extensively, but this is the kind of stuff that people tell you as well. And I think there's a great deal of truth here as well. And there's a chance to, and not a lot of people talk about this in my experience, but there's a chance to boost your income by working very hard for short amounts of time, right? For a month, you just work 70 hours a week, and you can, and especially when the market is good, you can actually make a lot of money. And I've heard this over and over again. And that's also harder when you just are stuck in a minimum wage job. Now, another reason why migrants like platform labor is it's a means to other ends, right? They all emphasize that it's a temporary thing, temporary nature, even though it's oftentimes also a dead end for many of them. So they see it as a stopgap opportunity, a stepping stone to something else. Eventually, even when this something else is not properly defined in their head yet, right? So it's an aspirational thing as well. There's also a kind of an investment attitude or a long-term view. So they're trying to save up for school, saving up for a business that they want to open. Sometimes it's even investment in like knowledge about the city, that they want to know the city and a bit better. So there's a lot of like this kind of investment long-term views on platform work, why they would do it. At the same time, they have a very, and this is the last point of why they kind of their situation is they have a very short-term frame of reference when it comes to Social Security. So gig work for them is a lifeline without a safety net. So it's a lifeline because it does offer them some sense of security, namely income security. And it also kind of makes them formally visible to the state in terms of paying taxes. And for some of them, that is a huge benefit as well. They don't want to be informal, work in the informal labor market. Right, they want to pay taxes. So there is a lifeline there, especially when they have very little other opportunities and they are not covered by Social Security as migrants. But of course, gig work in itself lacks a safety net, lacks labor rights protections. Everybody knows this already, of course. Migrants absorb the risks and the costs of gig work caused by information asymmetries, caused by lack of company support, caused by platforms encouraging unsafe behavior, for instance, when it's bad weather, or going into a house that you don't know anything about, the client, in terms of domestic work, but also, of course, the contractual status that many people have already talked about. So then finally, is reclassification the answer? We've heard this before already. And would migrant workers benefit from an employment contract? And my kind of provisional answer, or at least this opens up a long debate and we can discuss, it really depends. Namely, it depends on the migrant's personal situation, on their legal status, and also on labor and migration regulation of the nation states, but also on the response of gig platforms, finally, right? So how will they respond? Through deactivation? Sorry, yeah, I'll round up.
Sorry, you should be closing there.
Yeah, oh wait, oh shit, I went way over time. Anyway, I am very skeptical whether employment contracts will be the answer if migrant work is, if platform work is migrant work. And there's many reasons for that we could discuss.
Continuamos con Jessica y María Ivancheva.
Okay, gracias. Thank you, and I will share my screen. I hope you see me.
Sí.
Yeah?
Sí.
Okay, so Jessica.
Okay, thank you everybody for attending this meeting. I'm going to speak English so Maria and I can share the same language in the presentation, because we are both going to present our results. What we are presenting today is part of this project, is redefining essential work, the COVID-19 pandemic and high-skilled Venezuelan migrants in Argentina's platform economy. And it's a project that has already finished, but we are working still on data analysis and trying to find some results and some outputs. So this is what we are going to present today. Maria, if you can go to the other slide. Maria is going to present the background to the project. So she's going to introduce both of us and why we are cooperating in this project. Then we are going to present questions, methods, challenges. Then we are going to zoom in into the group study with secondary data, and then finally, we are going to introduce our preliminary findings with primary data, with interviews, and also with a survey. And then we are going to end with more questions than answers, but this is what we are trying to do here, to share some questions. So if you want to keep going, Maria.
Yeah, so just a background to the project, and some of you have already heard us present it, so sorry for the repetition. But the kind of first question that we had that we started speaking, came from me and Jessica meeting in Leeds some years, like 2 years ago, and speaking about the, where our work converges. So I had previously worked on Venezuelan higher education and the reproduction of new distinctions and the social mobility, especially for academics in the Bolivarian system of higher education. And then Jessica has worked on inequalities in social class, the myths of social stratification and upward mobility, and their implications for political orientation in Venezuela. Clara, can everybody mute their microphone, please? I'm gonna mute you. So, and then while we were having this conversation, I was also in Buenos Aires in late 2018, meeting many Venezuelan friends, including our translator here, Carmelo, who had meanwhile left. And there was a lot of talk about Venezuelan migrants, and there was always this portrayal of them as professionals, highly educated, highly skilled, but also there was the reality of them working in the gig and especially in the platform economy with very high concentration in the delivery apps. So we had first the idea to compare two different migrant populations in Venezuela, like Venezuelans in Colombia and in Argentina, but then and discuss more broadly the class-based experiences of migration. But then the COVID pandemic happened, and we had much more confined opportunities to do immersive work, like field work. But also there was kind of a new interest that we developed, which was around the types of labor that exist in the gig and the platform economy and its new status as essential work. So basically, that this is like how Venezuelans were portrayed, that many of them are working in the informal economy and are getting very little relief from Argentina. And then we were going to ask these questions about the, new ambivalent status of essential work, both essential, but also undervalued, underrecognized, and how migrants especially are negotiating the, flexibility or inflexibility and perhaps downward social mobility, especially vis-a-vis the effects of the pandemic. So what we did, we actually had two projects, one from the University of Liverpool, a seed core fund, and an SSRC grant, as Jessica explained, and we did 20 qualitative interviews with Venezuelan migrants in Buenos Aires and a survey. And so part of that is what we're going to focus on, because in both samples we had platform workers. So who were the Venezuelan migrants? Just before, I open the floor to Jessica again. Now we're using some secondary data, but what was really clear was that among Venezuelan migrants, there was at that point in time very high concentration of university and technical college credentials, unlike Venezuelan migrants in other countries. Most of them at that point had arrived with air transport, which is more expensive and more direct. So it also tells you something about their income or their savings. And that also was shown in the fact that only 14% said they lacked financial resources, unlike, say, migrants in Colombia who had 91% reported similar problems. So yeah, okay, oh, sorry. Many of them were on tourist or resident visa, and they had some permission to work. And then still, despite all this background, many of them worked like 70% in the informal economy. of the country, which was quite a high percentage, especially given the kind of higher qualifications and the alleged recognition of credentials in the Mercosur Union. And many of them, so over 60%, and the biggest part among the countries where this was studied, found their jobs in Argentina more risky than that in Venezuela. There was a very high concentration, especially in delivery work, and especially in Rappi and Globo, where most of the workers are Argentinians and Venezuela, are not Argentinians, and Venezuela formed a very high percentage. And then there was also, I'm sorry, you know, a higher percentage among platform workers that were Venezuelan had main source of income in the platform economy and higher education as opposed to Argentinians. So yeah, they worked much higher working hours and were getting like higher income, but also because they were working more, I guess. So here I leave to Jessica to take on and briefly lead us through many slides. So just tell me when to change, Jessica.
Very brief, because we have only 2 minutes.
Okay, carry on.
Okay. So what we are going to present, as I told you before, is the main output of the survey we did, which was an online survey with kind of problems during the fieldworks, but we can talk about this later. But what we find is that platform workers are usually the one with worse labor conditions, and also the one who worse background or social backgrounds. So only 2%, more males or more men are working on platform work than in another kind of jobs, in another kind of workers. And platform workers, when they are asked about what was their life when they live in Venezuela, they were going through more difficult to not only to change jobs or to find a job, but also to earning money, which is also a problem they share with other workers due to Venezuela's situation. And so when they were asked why they leave Venezuela, most of platform workers is because they want to find some better housing conditions or to make an experience, a life experience, but not also regarding safety or political prosecution, that it can be in another kind of workers, which are more the professionals like engineers and this kind of medical doctors. When they were asked about reasons to migrate Argentina and not other country, which is more mentioned, is the possibility of settling Argentina legally, because it's very easy to get a legal condition. There is not much immigration restrictions, and also because net worth, because they have some friends or relatives waiting for them, and also because they already knew and liked the city, and there is a lot of differentiation with another cities of Latin America, who seems a little bit more Latin American cities, and Argentina appears to be more like an European city, and so this is kind of very important for them. And when they are asked about how satisfied are with their life in this kind of moment, platform workers are the ones who are less comfortable or less satisfied with situation, financial situation, housing situations, and life. And also they are the ones who are, like, you can be in 62% less satisfied or not only to satisfied with your employment situation, but there is a kind of no differences between freedom, and it's kind of an issue that we can discuss later, that they try to say they love the freedom, or it's a very, when Maria talks about interviews, they always came with this kind of, well, now here in Argentina I am free. So this is important, is two kind of workers. Okay, Maria, if you want to go to the order. Okay, so just to take a look, platform workers didn't receive during the pandemic much protections. Only 20% received alcohol or hand sanitizer, only masks, they received only 50%. And most of them, yes, we are finished.
You should, okay.
Okay. More of them didn't feel value as essential workers, and more of them didn't feel safe at work, and especially in platform workers, it's a very big difference with another kind of workers who are having better social conditions. And due to social reproductions, platform workers have to, in depth, ask friends or bank or sell belongings, and they also, the one who lost their jobs and lost incomes, and also they are the one who less receive health support from the state or public support. So Maria, if you want to go to
and just, I mean, the interviews were finding similar thing. There was a very strong sense of, like on the one hand, lack of support, on the other, the need of working en negro more and more, even those that had, more legal positions. And then there was a sense of lack of, just like almost racism when it comes to them seen as bodies that bring contagion, but they were still very much believing that they're in a better city, like more European, more ordered, and that socialism is killing Argentina and is bringing Cuban style socialism there. So just one thing that I think just to outline, and maybe that's interesting to just connect to Nils's presentation, what we found was almost the opposite of what he's finding. So we're finding that there is much less freedom that has been reported, both in terms of like the long working hours, but also like that was not something that was prioritized in this type of jobs. And also there was much like job loss and a very high level of indebtedness as opposed to other workers. So in a certain way, that was not a preferred job. It was a very insecure job, but it was the only job available more and more when it came to the pandemic emergency. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you,
Sorry
Maria.
for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Maria and Jessica. We will continue with Tibor Messman. Tibor?
Now I'm on. Hi, everyone.
Yeah, you
could
are.
you just allow me to share my screen?
I think you should be allowed.
It says the host disabled participant screen sharing.
You should be able to do it now. You're a co-host.
Okay, thank you. Yes, it's working. So thanks so much for having me at this very inspiring and very loaded in terms of presentations and informations workshop. And as Maria mentioned in the beginning, indeed, besides the North and the South, I will talk more about the East. So my name is Tibor Messman. I'm coming from the Central European Labor Studies Institute. And my presentation is about the drivers, cab drivers and intercity platform drivers in Hungary. And basically my point is that these drivers are, even if they are migrants, they are invisible. So this is what my title of the presentation means too. In terms of what I will say, I also build my presentation on two projects. One is which is ongoing, and therefore these findings are also preliminaries. So the current project examines the role of social partners and collective bargaining and labor market integration of migrant workers, including platform workers in personal transport. But I also built on an earlier research, which was on regulation of platform work in personal transport and the role of social partners. Typically, I built in my data collection on cab drivers fora, online fora, newsletters, media, and local studies. And I also did in-depth interviews, which was indeed a big challenge for me. So finding good interlocutors for good interviews to find out what is going on in terms, especially in terms of migrant workers. Excuse me, I just hear some noise, and it's. Could you just mute your microphones if for others? Okay, so just to give a big overview, because I don't have much time. So basically, platform economy is not regulated in Hungary. So platform economy as such appears as deviating or innovative segment of some traditional sectors and subsectors. This is also the case in local personal transport. It's blooming, especially in labor cost sensitive sectors where more informal services are characteristic, and it goes with high level of informality, and the form of small entrepreneurship is very important, but as you will see in the Hungarian context, it means something very different. Typically, those working via platforms, this means they work either as self-employed, small entrepreneurs, or they have minor employment contracts at best. These employment forms do not provide good grounds for self-organization, contribute also to invisibility, as I will say later. And in terms of policy issues, taxation, regulation of fair competition is at the forefront. In terms of platform companies, both Uber and Taxify, now both appeared after the so-called global economic crisis, after 2012. So basically 2014, after 2014, but also intercity companies appeared after. This is something that I don't have time, but this is highly interesting because it shows from a long durée perspective, which we nurture, cultivate at the public sociology group Helyzet in Budapest, which basically shows how from the 1970s, this reintegration of the Hungarian economy went. And personal cab transport is highly interesting because exactly this was one of the most vivid sectors which nurtured this self-entrepreneurial habitus of freedom, etc. So you have lots of developments there. I won't go through each point of this slide. Just to mention that there was in the 80s, late 80s and 90s, this was the so-called tip service profession. So there was tipping was very important. Incomes were relatively high. During the early 2000s, there was a strong belief still in the free market, which collapsed with the global financial crisis. And after the crisis, this was when it came about that there was a new regulation, also due to self-organized cab drivers. So they pushed for regulation. There is a minimal requirements of taxi operating companies and also for drivers. So it's highly regulated service market, but also the labor market. I don't have time to go into all the regulations, but what I come up with is three types, just to explain to you how traditional cab companies and also platform companies are operating in taxi companies. So this is taxi companies. I will come back later to intercity companies in a slide. So basically, you have a taxi organizing company that does not have employee drivers as its employees, but only manages the market, right? So they typically have the dispatcher still, and basically they contract both small entrepreneur drivers or undeclared drivers. But let's say that these cooperative entrepreneurial types are, let's say, fully legal, and all their drivers are enlisted, and they pay their contributions, taxes, etc. after themselves. They own their own car. They take care of all elements of regulation. There is another type, which is a more mixed, and this is where you have small entrepreneurs, which are contracted, which have this contract with taxi organizing companies. And this is important to say also that what happens here, that these drivers pay an annual fee to these taxi organizing companies. So it's about 500 euros per month. So this is a fee that they need to pay each and every time. But you also have fleet companies, which contract also taxi organizing companies. And basically these act as employers or subcontractors. So basically these are the ones that then bring in new drivers into the labor market. And this is actually the point where the platform, and this is the type 3, imagine this more as a heuristical portrayal of what's going on. So basically you have a platform company that only contracts platform companies. And these fleet companies then have typically undeclared or employees with minor employment contracts. Now the trouble here is that these minor employment contracts are what I was told is 2 hours per day, whereas these drivers are working 14 hours often per day, which has several reasons why this is so. So on the one hand, automatically all the platform companies are taking off automatically a share of the drive, but moreover, these employees also need to pay the costs of car rental to fleet companies. So there is a huge inducement for these drivers to work as much as possible and increase income, although the bulk of this income, so it's basically a kind of almost rat race, so to say. In terms of migrant workers, and this is the second part of my presentation, and I will try to be very quick. So basically there are two entry points into the labor market, and one is a high entry point and the other one is a low entry point. The high entry point is a kind of entrepreneurial, where you have the dominant form of self-entrepreneurship, where you have developed, highly developed social networks, where you know how to manage costs, you own your own car, you have your bookkeeper, you know how to pay and where to pay and how to bargain for a better position, let's say. And then you have the low entry to this labor market, which means a double dependency, which I explained already, that you enter into a fleet company and you have a dual dependency, right? So basically, this is the trouble, that we don't have real data. But the thing is, and this is very interesting for Hungary and especially for Budapest, which has the biggest market here, that the migrant workers are invisible. So this again, it's a very different story that we heard from Niels, but also partly from about Argentina and Venezuelan workers. What I heard, and this is only because we don't have that much data.
Sorry, you should be closing.
Okay, thank you. Just a slide or two. So basically, this is interesting because we already found earlier that platform companies and traditional companies are taking over certain practices from each other. And one of the cases that was reported by one of my interlocutors, that cab drivers were brought in Hungary from Romania, and basically they were kept, 12 of them, in one house in really bad conditions. So to push down the costs of and create, let's say, unfair competition. There is also problems of regulation, because inspectorates cannot really see what is going on within fleets. For the high threshold entry, there is still some sort of coordination and interest representation. but trade unions are typically closed, and they are more common to only one taxi company, not platform company. And this is just to highlight quickly, because this is an entirely new thing which is developing now, and this is the issue of intercity online drivers. So you have an unregulated market of services and jobs, and basically you have a situation when in an unregulated environment there are jobs, and they know these people know how to use platforms in order to create market and to create jobs. But altogether, I find this as a preliminary, as a job opportunity for highly socially integrated, educated migrant workers only, and some preliminary conclusions. So there is a double visibility of migrant workers, also because of data issue. So there are no records of subcontracted drivers. And then you have either highly integrated, educated, skilled drivers who are atomized, or you have highly dependent subcontracted migrant workers. So this is in brief. Thank you very much for your attention and patience.
Thank you, Tibor, for your time. Okay, I will recollect some questions that are now on the chat, so we can ask you to all of you. Is one here for Niels Bandor. Sorry, it's up here. Questions for Niels Bandor. In your opinion, an employment contract is not flexible for delivery and domestic workers. What is the most optimal contractual arrangement for delivery and domestic workers?
No, I have to clarify.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that an employment contract is not feasible for delivering domestic work. I think that's very feasible. But we're talking about migrant work now, and we need to make sure that, my point is, we need to make sure that migrant workers, all workers, are properly insured, protected, have a minimum wage or higher, preferably a living wage, there's no one size fits all, right? And we need to not think that just an employment contract is always a silver bullet. Other regulations will have to change. Other things will need to happen. For instance, just one short example to clarify, in the Netherlands, migrant students from outside the EU, they cannot work for over 16 hours a week. While if they are under an employment contract, if they're independent contractor, however, they can work as much as they want. But they're of course less protected, but they can work more and they need that type of money because they need to pay off their debts, they need to send money home. So in that sense, there's this loophole in Netherlands regulation that kind of pushes them into independent contracting. So we need to also look at migration, like other types of regulations, migration regulation, in how it intersects with labor market regulation and social regulation of welfare, and revise this and raise the bar across low-wage labor markets. So I'm not saying that entrepreneurship is the way to go, definitely not. I'm not saying that employment contract is not feasible. I'm just saying that we have to look critically at who's doing this work and what works best for them. And we need to ask them more often and involve them in this kind of regulation and policy making. So that's, I think, gets closer to what I am saying.
Okay, thank you. Then we have another question for Maria and Jessica, that it says, in the UK context, the pandemic created conditions where migrants and essential have become more visible, as opposite to before COVID. Can we speak about the similar situation change in Argentinian context?
Lucia, I think because we and also Tibor kind of took a lot of time. Maybe you can read all the questions that are coming and then we can just take turns answering, because otherwise we would end up very late. Yeah.
Okay, we have only one less for Julieta that says, si los trabajadores migrantes tienen participación en las organizaciones colectivas como sindicatos, eso para todos en general, no para alguien en particular.
So maybe just, I wanted to share something to the exchange that we had with news earlier, and that would be very quickly this slide. So I think, you know, I mean, it's a very big slide with a lot of information, but basically it shows how the, you know, the platform workers have, in fact, you know, are next to small business owners who had absolutely no autonomy or freedom at work, and were feeling that their financial situation had really dropped down during the pandemic. Like the platform workers were the next worst, you know, in this. So very, very strong sense of lack of labor freedom in the sense of, you know, how do you control your time, and also in the sense that a lot of them were in very vulnerable positions when the pandemic started, and lost income. And so this kind of entrepreneurialism that maybe was there before, it just stopped being an issue. It was like a matter of going out to work every day, you know, and working more and more hours and so forth. So, and I'm not sure I understood well Julieta's question. Maybe Julieta, you can ask it quickly, like switching yourself on, like you're asking about the representation by unions. I mean, your work, yeah.
She wanted to, sorry, I say it in Spanish before. She wanted to know how is the collective organization for migrants in each of the countries?
I think she's probably better off answering this question because she's kind of actually covered it. But there have been already before the pandemic certain like new unions that were formed specifically by migrant workers in the platform economy. And so it's, I mean, what would be interesting is to see if there are new and different tactics of organizing, of communication and so forth. But that's not something that we have studied. We did have more on NGOs, you know, and to what extent they have been active during the pandemic. And that's like most migrants would have contact point at the beginning, and sometimes they would contact them for some aid, you know, during it, but there wasn't like a kind of strong sense of diasporic organizing in this way that it would kind of really carry through also labor rights and other forms of collective organizing. That's maybe what we can say. And to, I think to Julius Caesar's question, Jessica,
maybe,
or we can leave it for the chat because we're already
we maybe
much
can
over time.
extend the question to Tibor so we can know if there is any collective organization of workers in their country, in his country.
So the question is related to platform workers, right? Platform workers as such, no. Like in Hungary, this is not really the case.
Okay. 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 Thank you all for your time then. We will have 5 minutes of recess, I think. And then we will be back to the last panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we meet here in 5 minutes, 12 in Argentina.
Las expositores y los expositores son María Belén Albornoz, de la Facultad Latinoamericana de Ciencias Sociales de Ecuador, Ana Ilse y Trine Larsen, de la Universidad de Copenhague, y Kurt van Dael, del Instituto Sindical Europeo. Antes de pasarles la palabra en ese orden a María Belén, quería recordarles que por favor intenten ser precisos en el uso del tiempo, porque estamos un poco asustados, y a la audiencia recordarles que pueden ir dejando sus preguntas, consultas en el chat. Muchas gracias. Entonces le paso la palabra a María Belén Albornoz.
Muchísimas gracias. Lo que quisiera, por favor, es si me pueden habilitar compartir pantalla.
I'm trying to find you among the speakers in order to be able to make you.
I'm like Maria Belén Albornoz.
Yeah. Just a second. Here it is.
Perfect. Let me see. Here we are. Can you see the presentation now?
Sí, se ve bien.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this great panel. I will be presented a work called Labor 4.0, Black Markets, Immigration, and Fair Work. Ecuador has approximately, wait a second, I'm trying to find this thing. Okay, Ecuador has approximately 500,000 immigrants living in the country, most of whom are from, and many of whom live in an irregular migratory situation. An immigrant without a visa cannot work, which creates a convenient scenario for abuse on the part of employers and hinders immigrants' ability to organize and negotiate for their rights. While breaking into the Ecuadorian economy as a foreigner is difficult, the gig economy offers quick, accessible work for those who have valid immigration papers. This has led to a new method of disguising undocumented immigration, the renting of profiles in order to apply for jobs on digital platforms or work under someone else's profile, and earn less than half of what the platform pays. Methodologically, by examining qualitative workers, networks, and research strategies, this presentation proposes a micro-level analysis of the mechanisms through which the structural exploitation of immigrant workers takes shapes in Ecuador platform's economy. During the last decade, Ecuador has received more than 630,000 immigrants. Most of them come from Venezuela, 22% from Colombia, Peru 8%, Cuba 7%. Even if the attractive effect began to diminish after 2015 with the drop in the oil prices, economic recession, and more restrictive migration policy and political changes, the intensification of the negative condition in neighboring countries, Colombia's internal war and Venezuela's political and economic crisis, maintained the migrant inflow until the end of the decade. The COVID-19 pandemic marked a new breaking point in 2020. About 75,000 immigrants left the country during this year. As part of the Fair Work project, from March to December 2020, 46 semi-structured interviews were conducted with workers from 6 platforms. 5 interviews were conducted with platform managers, and 10 in-depth interviews were took place with migrant workers, complemented this desk review in January 2021. To find a job, Venezuelan citizens must hold a visa for a temporary residence or permanent visa resident. These visas allow Venezuelans to apply for an Ecuadorian identification document. Thus far, a total of 195,000 visas have been granted to Venezuelan citizens. President Moreno estimates that the number of Venezuelans in the country far exceeds the reception capacity of Ecuador, which has 70.2 million inhabitants and spent more than 500 million in healthcare and education for immigrants. In this context, as of September 2019, a fine of $800 was imposed on immigrants who exceeded the maximum of 180 days granted by them by Ecuador to stay as tourists. This leaves around 170,000 Venezuelan citizens undocumented in Ecuador, with significant administrative and financial barriers to regularizing their immigration status. When the Uber and ride-hailing platforms arrived to the country 4 years ago, these activities did not have any regulations. Therefore, they accepted Venezuelan documents to open a worker account, which allowed immigrants to work with their own profiles. However, as the volume of operation grew, local governments began to push for regulation. This has restricted the access for new gig workers. Many immigrants could not apply for a platform account due to the lack of documentation, such as a work visa, an Ecuadorian ID, or a driver's license. Most of the immigrant workers interviewed have stated that they already knew a friend or family member living in Ecuador who helped them settle in the country. Social capital and network ties were transformed into a key resource into which to gain access to employment. Digital platforms became part of the immigration network as soon as they succeeded in offering sustainable livelihood for immigrants. Hence, the recourse of subcontracting began to be used to provide job opportunities for those immigrants. However, this has structured mechanisms for work exploitation by transferring an entire spectrum of risk from employers to workers, increasing precarious and unfair working conditions. Moreover, most immigrant workers do not have a vehicle to work with. This has opened the door for them to rent one from the investors. That's how they call the people who offers their vehicles to rent. Cabify, a hail rating platform, had a list of car owners looking for drivers. Workers were free to contact them to bargain regarding working conditions. Arrangements were of two types: a fixed weekly value or 50% of the operation. From the evidence we have gathered, the fixed weekly value varied from $75 to $100. Interviewed immigrant workers renting a car declared to have an average working day of 11 hours and earn approximately $200 a week. After paying the car rent, they are left with only 50% of the income, approximately $400 a month, which is the minimum wage for an 8-hour work day in Ecuador. When platforms began requiring Ecuadorian driver licenses and work permits, immigrant workers were forced to rent profiles accounts as well. They must now pay for the vehicle as well as someone else's platform profile. According to the majority of delivery workers we interviewed, those who rent profiles must pay between $50 and $40 a week. In the case of delivery workers, if they are renting a profile and a motorbike, they may pay up to $50 per week. Interviewed delivery workers declared to earn an average of $190 a week, and after subcontracting costs, they can make around $560 a month. The employment of platform workers is a controversial issue. Gig workers face a difficult situation regarding labor rights, volatile income, a lack of benefits, and precarity and exploitation conditions. According to the platforms, workers are considered autonomous entrepreneurs who manage their own time and have no boss. Thus, platforms are detached from any employment. If formal subcontracted practice are added to these conditions, workers are structural that makes them invisible and unprotected by the law and social benefits. Those who are renting their profiles are becoming platform labor intermediaries that function as infrastructural agents, forcing workers to shoulder all risks and responsibilities in a reconstitution of labor relationships. In order to understand how these structural forms of exploitation are taking place, it is of paramount importance that we include all players in the subcontracted infrastructure. With a black market of profiles and accounts for regular immigrants, the incentives of the algorithm management system may be divided and shared by two or more individuals with very different backgrounds and behaviors. Hence, from a ride costing 80 cents awarded by the algorithm, the actual worker receives only half that amount or less. The rest goes to intermediaries who profit without being managed. In other words, immigrant workers are subject to the same disciplinary algorithm regime of punishment that a normal user is, but for a smaller reward. Moreover, the recompense is shared among various people, while the penalties and the physical effort are not. The problems created by the systems are all shouldered by the undocumented worker, whose daily life is managed and conditioned by this Pavlovian machine. Most of the interviewees who participated in this research mentioned using or having used a rented account. The lack of documents such as passport, driver's license, or local residency or work permit seems to be the main entry barrier that pushes them to use the profile black market. These barriers may be an indirect consequence of local authorities' attempts to regulate these activities and force the platforms to comply with local regulations. This explanation shifts the burden of this problem from platforms to local governments or regulations themselves. Nonetheless, for other accounts from the same interviewees suggest other possibility. Platforms have blocked access for new members for several months already. This delay in the new profiles approval is what has been feeding the expansion of the black market profiles, and platforms are profiting from it because they can continue changing their terms and conditions and reducing the rate they pay to workers. The immigration variable introduced a new dimension to the algorithmic management problem. More precisely, the technological black box extends beyond the limit of the platforms on which exists. In a Black Mirrorian twist, the gray zones created by migration and failed regulations have left the machine break out of its box and increase its potential to discipline not only those registered in the database, but also those who are not allowed to be there. Thank you.
Belén. Ana Ilse y Trin Larsen.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Thank you. I'll try to share my screen.
Yeah, I would need to make you just a second. I have to make you a co-host. I think I managed.
Okay. So, thank you everyone for inviting me and Srini for this very interesting seminar. We are going to present a mutual piece of work on multiple job holding in the digital platform economy in the global north, namely in the case of Denmark. And we think actually, even though we are using statistics from Denmark, this is a general feature of platform work in the Nordics. So it's very interesting and it's very relevant also when we discuss possibilities for regulation and relevance of regulation. It's been funded by various Danish research funds, and we fully acknowledge that. So the background is like everybody else presented at this seminar, the growth in personal income via digital platforms. And many of these platforms are weakly regulated settings, individualizing the risks, but at the same time operating outside the collective risk protection that we usually know, especially in the global north, that we have this wider institutional framework, the welfare state, collective bargaining. Typically, they operate outside that. So it's what do you call it? A cocktail that's not so beneficial with larger risks, but less protection. However, at the same time, we can see that various forms of platforms attract different groups, meaning that they might have different buffers in their lives when they arrive at the platform. It means something what they earn outside the platform, and that was what we wanted to investigate. So we asked the questions: do distinct types of digital platforms attract different groups, such as lower skilled young people, women, and migrants? And how do income from these platforms in combination with alternative income sources outside the platforms, like other jobs, income support, and so on, affect the exposure to income insecurities? So a combination effect of traditional forms of income with the new forms of income on the platforms. Our theoretical framework was inspired by the segmentation theory, where we wanted to combine high and low income levels from the traditional labor market, meaning from traditional jobs and self-employment, with income via digital platforms. So we have 4 situations that combines high and low income levels via the platforms with high and low income levels via the traditional labor market. So in the case of a high income level via the traditional labor markets and a high income level via the platforms, you could see a situation of reinforcing segmentation, whereas high income from the traditional labor market with low income via the platform would be a maintaining situation, maintaining existing segmentations. In comparison, low levels of income via the traditional labor market in combination with high platform income would actually reduce segmentation. And a low income via the traditional labor market in combination with low income via the platforms would be an increasing segmentation. That was our analytical framework. What was our method? We brought in 3 questions to the Danish labor force survey in 2017 and 2019 on income via digital platforms, and we combined that with national admin register data. So we brought in questions on whether you have earned money via a labor platform during the last year, whether you have earned money via a capital platform, and how much you have earned via the last year before taxes. And we were asking about various income levels. What were our results? Well, first of all, and I think that's in the global north quite a widespread result, that activity on digital platform is still rather limited when compared to the total labor market. So in Denmark, 1% of all on the labor market have earned money via a labor platform during the last year. A little more have earned money via a capital platform during the last year. But most interestingly, there are almost no one who have done both. 0.1% answer in our survey. We have both earned money via labor and capital platform, meaning we have 2 very different groups here. So how much did they earn? Most of them earned less than 3,300 euro per year, meaning that at least in a Danish setting and also in a Nordic setting, we would value that as a supplementary earning to other main sources of earnings. We can observe a slight increase in the group on capital platforms earning more than 3,300 euro per year, which we find interesting. More than a fourth now earn more than that on the capital platforms. And finally, most people on platforms in Denmark are multiple job holders. They have either a job or their own company, being self-employment on the traditional labor market. And this is increasing. Now we have 2/3 on the labor platforms are multiple job holders, and 3 and 4 on the capital platforms have a job outside the platform. These figures we obtained via a survey we combined with registered data in Denmark and the other Nordic countries. We have national admin register data on all citizens, which we can combine with surveys. So we added in the variable on the total personal income from the traditional labor market and compared that with whether you have earned money via a platform. And we divided that into 4 income quartiles, and we compared labor and capital platforms. As you can see here, more than 40% of those active on labor platforms are from the lowest income quartile on our labor market. Whereas if we compare with capital platforms, more than 40% active on capital platforms are in the highest income quartile on our labor market. What does this mean when we use our analytical framework? Well, those active on the labor platforms, they come with the lowest buffer in their life, the lowest income, and they combine that with a supplementary earning quite low on the labor platform. We interpreted this as labor platforms in Denmark and perhaps also in the other Nordic countries are increasing an existing segmentation on the labor market. Whereas on the capital platforms, you combine a high income from the traditional labor market with also mostly a quite low income via the capital platform, maintaining existing segmentation tendencies. However, we also see an increase in earnings. This might in the future lead to reinforcing segmentation tendencies. Conclusions. Only 10 minutes, so we rush into conclusions. In Denmark, and I would say seen from other Nordic investigations, also in the other Nordic countries, platform providers are typically multiple job holders. We have very few who are full-time online. Very few utilize both capital and labor platforms. We have very distinct groups using these two types of platforms. This means we have groups that have very different buffers in their lives. Capital platform users have a high buffer and can cope with large risks in the platform economy, whereas labor platform earners have a low buffer in the traditional income, and they have less possibilities of handling the individual risks on the platform from this buffer. And also we can see that labor and capital platforms contribute to different segmentation tendencies that we already see on the traditional labor market. This is the reference from our study, which has just been published in Transfer. And also I want to hint at a new research project. We just got a large grant from a Danish fund to do follow-up studies. And we're going to study now longitudinal register data on these platform workers we have in our sample. What will their employment histories be after the platform? And also we are going to follow the development via digital time series data. What will happen after the platform for these workers? So we hope that will lead to interesting studies as well. Thank you very much for your attention.
Interesting. Thank you, Ana. Le paso la palabra a Kurt, entonces.
Thank you.
And I have made you a co-host, Kurt.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon from Belgium. I will also start sharing my screen. So in my talk, I will make two main arguments. One is that labor agency is still possible in the platform economy, and this is especially holds true for location-based platform work. And secondly, at the same time in Western Europe, at least, we see a shift to more diversity and the collective representation of workers. So there's some kind of organizational creativity ongoing, although most of those types seems to be not new. So I start building on Beverly Silver, on her work on power resource theory. And I'm looking here at structural power. So this is more or less defined by external circumstances, or if you will, by luck. I'm looking at workplace bargaining power of platform workers and marketplace bargaining power of platform workers. Workplace bargaining power refers to the position of a worker in the production process, while marketplace bargaining power is looking at the labor market. And then I differentiate between online platform work and location-based platform work. If you look at workplace bargaining power, then this is mostly weak, with the exception of worker-initiated online platform work, where there, I think it depends on the position of this worker and global value chains, if he or she has some power. And then more importantly, I think if you look at platform work in locations, and especially in public settings, so food delivery and also taxis, I think there the workplace bargaining power can be accessed as quite strong. And then, well, if you compare it with other types of platform work, if I look at marketplace bargaining power, then I think it's mostly weak, but it also depends on the skills of the workers. So in online platform work, which is initiated by the worker, there depends on the skill level of the worker. So it could be considered as intermediate sometimes, and maybe also in private sector and settings in location-based platform work, for instance, repair work. So based on this on this analysis of structural power of platform workers, I'm now looking at the associational power of platform workers. First of all, requester and worker-initiated online platform work. This type of work is less embedded in local institutional regulatory frameworks. So collective resistance is still possible, I think, especially if it's geographically clustered. For instance, in certain cities, there might be such type of platform work. And I believe there was a recent example of Serbia where freelancers were protesting. But collective resistance at the local, regional, or national level alone will be less effective, I think. So also labor internationalism and regulatory provisions beyond those local levels are needed. And there are a few examples already. So there are attempts for bringing platforms into more self-regulation. I can refer here to the work of the Oxford Internet Institute, like the Fair Work Foundation, or initiatives by the largest German union, IG Metall, like Fair Crowd Work and crowdsourcing codes of conduct. We also see that freelancers or those platform workers are setting up or discussing their types of their work in discussion forums, but most of those discussion forums are set up and controlled by the platforms. However, if you look at outside the platform work, we see that freelancers also have their own collective organizations, because the welfare state regime is sometimes inadequate to provide them social protection. So they set up their own organizations, like for mutual aid, or there can also be the involvement of labor market intermediaries. Do they have an interest in collective representation by unions? Well, I think here it depends on if unions if they have collective needs, and if unions are providing this. It also depends on their political orientation. So more left-leaning freelancers are more inclined to join a union. Organizing solo self-employed, the solo self-employed or freelancers is not new to unions. And there are examples of recent initiatives as well of unions providing more services to freelancers. Overall, unions are here attempting a logic of a membership approach. So they try to have collective bargaining agreements, and they also provide individual benefits for those workers. Turning to location-based platform work and private settings, here we know already that they have different specific profiles. For instance, in care and cleaning, those are mostly women with a migrant background. I would guess that men are more working in repair. We also have seen that this type of platform work is more or less maintaining or reinforcing existing risks and vulnerabilities, and for instance, in care and cleaning. If you look at collective resistance, then there's a danger that clients could easily switch to another platform, And also the platform workers could have professional loyalty towards individual clients, but at the same time, those clients could have some empathy to the issues and needs of platform workers. I think what is key and for the future of this type of platform work is whether this will be evolved to one-off service or development of a professional relationship between the client and the platform worker. Interesting to know as well is that and this type of platform work, there are possibilities to have worker-initiated platform work or to set up self-organizing via platform groups. In Denmark, we have also well, not so recent now, but the example of a collective agreement between a platform company and the unions. It's still on the company level, but I believe there are also talks now for having an agreement at the sectoral level. Looking now at location-based platform work in public settings, and I refer here to the case of food delivery because this is the sector I know most of it. Here I think you have two kinds of logics in terms of representation, a logic of membership by activist groups and grassroots unions. Food delivery is a very visible platform-based industry, and therefore I think it's also symbolic of the platform economy. We know in Europe that industrial action started in 2016 in the UK, and then spread out to the continental Europe. Motivations of the workers were remuneration problems, and process is still ongoing in some European countries. And also an issue was the shift to contractor status back then. Of course, collective resistance is not shared by all careers. It also depends on their the stage of their life and to what extent they are economically attached to the platform work. So careers have some associational power here via activist groups or of careers. They are active on and offline, online and digital communities, and they are also able to meet physically. We also know that there is an international organization called the Transnational Careers Federation, which was set up in 2018. And for the activist groups of careers, the question is whether they will work together with grassroots unions or mainstream unions. And here I think it mostly depends whether our grassroots unions are active or present or not in the countries. But both, even grassroots unions, are not only protesting, but also setting up litigations actions. If you look at the mainstream unions and location-based platform work, those can offer the careers or the groups of activist groups of careers, financial resources, organizational knowledge, and as said before, they're seeking regularly solutions for litigation actions. And here the unions are relying on what they know from the industrial relations system where they're active in, so they are following more or less institutional logic. There are some recent examples of regulation. There's a kind of soft regulation in Bologna and Italy. There's new regulation in Spain. Works councils has been set up in Austria and Germany. And there have been attempts, or there are even collective agreements in a number of European countries. And then
sorry, Kurt, last minute.
Okay, I will go to my conclusions. So what I notice is a kind of modest spurt in collective organization building, causing some organizational diversity in Europe, and at least in Western Europe. Those organizations show the imprint of their time, meaning that they are also engaging in digital representation. Some of those organizational types remind of the past. I'm thinking about, for instance, cooperatives. And then the main question is to what extent do they cope with the existing unions, and then they align to different types of representation logics. And I will leave it here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Kurt. Abrimos entonces. Hay dos, si no se me pasó ninguna. Es la mesa un comentario con una pregunta final que dice: me llama la atención no haber escuchado en las presentaciones alguna referencia al componente de género en la fuerza de trabajo de las plataformas. ¿Podrían dar alguna información al respecto? María Belén algo estuvo contestando, pero se la paso al resto de los integrantes de la mesa, y leo otra que apareció ahora, si pueden ir respondiéndolas y después pasamos al intervalo y al bloque final. Una para Kurt, dice: how do you link representation of platform workers with the fact that it is considered often additional activity next to the main job? Les cedo la palabra a quienes quieran ir contestando. No sé si María Belén, vos querés responder, o Ana.
Las respuestas las prefieren en español o en inglés. ¿Cómo les están trabajando la dinámica? ¿Da igual?
Da igual porque hay traducción simultánea.
Ah, perfecto. Entonces, tal vez en español. En el caso de Ecuador, la gran mayoría de los trabajadores de plataforma de delivery y de transporte son hombres. Hay otras plataformas que tienen más mujeres, especialmente la de belleza, la del cuidado de animales. En el Ecuador no son muy populares todavía las plataformas de limpieza, especialmente en la época, este último año con el COVID, esto ha sido todavía más difícil, ¿no? Sin embargo, es interesante ver que quienes lideran las organizaciones, especialmente de trabajadores migrantes, son mujeres. Sin embargo, casi todas han tratado de no identificarse plenamente de manera pública porque las plataformas han tendido a despedirlas, a no contratarlas más. Entonces esto ha sido un problema muy grave, ¿no? Pero ya empiezan a haber demandas judiciales explícitas de estas personas, especialmente de Julie Ramírez, que es una de las activistas más importantes, que además está trabajando por los derechos de género de las mujeres vinculados al acoso, tanto de los clientes como de los dueños de los restaurantes, etcétera, ¿no? Entonces, de la policía en la calle, porque ese es otro de los temas fuertes con el que tienen que lidiar los trabajadores de plataforma en Ecuador, especialmente si son de origen venezolano. Entonces, hay un proyecto bien interesante del Observatorio de Plataformas que está trabajando específicamente género en el trabajo del gig economy en Ecuador. Con mucho gusto les puedo dar luego las referencias sobre las investigaciones que ellos han estado haciendo en términos de género.
No sé si Ana o Kurt
you
quieren.
Want me to answer for the Nordics?
Go ahead.
I can comment on the Nordic situation, but okay. Yeah, okay. So the gender issue in the Nordics is, at least for our Danish figures, is like 50-50. So half of the platform workers are women, half of them are men. However, our figures are too small that I cannot differentiate them out on the single platforms. And then I think I want to add something about multiple job holding and collective bargaining, because of course this has implications. And you could say that the situation that it's a supplementary earning make collective bargaining even more important, because these workers, they do not earn enough as self-employed to have their own insurance, to pay their own pensions and so on. So it's important that somebody else creates a structure around it and make sure that all these types of protections are there. So even though you could maybe imagine that multiple job holding and small earnings in platforms would make collective bargaining less important, you could also argue the opposite, at least to my mind. Thank you.
Yes, regarding the gender, I don't have any data on figures on this, except for one small case in Belgium on platform-based food delivery, and there this was overwhelmingly performed by men. So this is more or less reflecting what is going on outside the platform economy in terms of the transportation sector. I have seen another question in the chat by Martin. So I will read the question. How do you link representation of platform workers with the fact that it concerns often additional activities next to the main job? I think here the interest of unions is that some of the platform activities are quite symbolic for the platform economy, and I'm thinking here, and very visible, and I'm thinking here now of food delivery. So this could make unions more visible, and often those jobs are performed by young workers and migrant workers. So it also shows then that unions are engaging with this type of workers. Of course, there's the issue of whether unions should recruit those workers. This is also an ideological question for unions, but from a cost-benefit perspective, it might be not so worthwhile for some of those platform workers because they simply could not afford it. But I think the interest is in for unions is also in mobilizing and organizing those workers instead of rather than recruiting them. I will leave it here.
Scott, hay alguna pregunta más en el chat, pero no sé si prefieren pasar al receso y dejarlas para la discusión final para el plenario dentro de 5 minutos.
Quizás una o dos preguntitas más, Nico, y cerramos.
Para Juan, can you elaborate further on your understanding of difference between capital and labor platforms?
We can try to do that. I think Anna had to leave, unfortunately. We define a capital platform as leasing out private properties by a platform like Airbnb or GoMore, or where you have other vehicles you're leasing out. We didn't classify Uber as a capital platform. We see a labor platform as a where you are selling your, what you call it, your labor online platform. So that's the distinctions we're making. One is for private assets, the other one is your labor that you are selling and making available in return for pay. So I hope that clarifies the issue.
Muy bien, y finalmente otra para Kurt, que dice, to what extent do you see whether these unions are involved in digital related issues around algorithmic management and workplace surveillance?
What is meant by unions, mainstream unions or grassroots unions, or I don't know, but this is certainly an issue that is high on the agenda of the mainstream unions in Europe, and they're also lobbying the European Commission for a better regulation for this. And of course, in many countries, there are also health and safety rules at the workplace. So also there, this can be used, and there's also the GDPR regulation at the European level, which might be used in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Kurt. Bueno, hasta aquí las preguntas. No sé si quieren pasar directamente a la reunión plenaria o hacer un receso. Les pregunto a los organizadores.
Quizás, gracias Nicolás, que no te presenté. Nicolás es un compañero investigador del Instituto de Estudios del Trabajo de Argentina, el Consejo Nacional de Ciencia y Tecnología. Yo iría sobre todo por traductores para tener un respiro. Hacemos un corte de 5 minutos y bueno, vamos a un intercambio plenario.
I will stop recording then, and we'll come back recording in the last session. Thank you.
Entonces, ahí estamos grabando para ir concluyendo este encuentro, este webinar. De nuestra parte estamos muy contentas de la gran participación que hemos tenido y del intercambio con investigadores e investigadoras de diferentes latitudes, diferentes geografías, que era nuestra principal intención, porque sabemos que hay muchísimos eventos sobre trabajo de plataformas e intentamos aportar a que haya también diálogo entre las diferentes investigaciones. Así que este espacio lo pensamos para, bueno, profundizar un poco en las temáticas que se trataron, poder seguir discutiendo, contestando preguntas que quedaron pendientes. Por mi parte, un poco en la lectura de los diferentes paneles y en la pregunta acerca de continuidades, transformaciones, similitudes y diferencias en el trabajo de plataformas en diferentes lugares, lo que creo que queda bastante claro tiene que ver con los problemas en relación a la precariedad que tiene este tipo de trabajos de plataformas y cómo erosionan las instituciones principales del trabajo, ¿no? Tanto el salario como protecciones sociales, a la seguridad social. Esto atravesó, creo yo, desde el primer panel, con algunos datos que daba Janine y Marten, más en términos conceptuales, y que aportó finalmente también Ana en el caso de Dinamarca, y pensar la situación de pluriempleo, ¿no? Cómo se ven estas situaciones de trabajadores del norte global, que por una parte parece ser que apelan al trabajo de plataformas para complementar sus ingresos, y al mismo tiempo lo que dice Ana, de que los ingresos de plataformas no son suficientes y por eso hay situaciones de pluriempleo. En el caso también de trabajadores del sur, la gran problemática de bajos salarios, salarios mínimos muy bajos, y cómo estas empresas de plataformas constituyen en este sentido un horizonte deseable para trabajadores para poder mejorar su situación, y atravesando todo esto, la falta de seguridad social, como muchos en el chat preguntaron y quedó sin contestar, la cuestión de las protecciones a la salud de los trabajadores, en lo que tiene que ver con higiene y seguridad, que ahí hay un terreno donde hay mucho para hacer en el ámbito de la regulación y de la negociación colectiva. Así que eso me parece que han sido algunos de los puntos salientes dentro de estas participaciones. Desde ya, quien quiera agregar, comentar, preguntar, tanto expositores como oyentes, en el chat está habilitado.
I see Maria Belén is raising her hand, so perhaps you can unmute and speak.
Thank you. Sí, creo que uno de los puntos que nosotros hemos descubierto con el trabajo de Fair Work en Ecuador es que todas aquellas personas que iniciaron trabajando en plataformas pensaban que era un salto a un segundo trabajo, ¿no? Era un trabajo temporal. Sin embargo, la gran mayoría de ellos tiene este trabajo como su principal fuente de ingresos. Cada vez trabajan más horas. Cuando las plataformas no les permiten trabajar más de 12 horas, trabajan entre varias aplicaciones para poder trabajar 14 horas, 15 horas diarias. Esta es la única manera que ellos tienen para poder ahorrar. De lo contrario, pues, especialmente si están subcontratando perfiles, se vuelve muy difícil para ellos, como decía al inicio, ganar el sueldo básico, ¿no? Entonces, este es un punto que sí creo que sí se diferencia mucho de las prácticas de plataformas en países del norte, donde este trabajo es un trabajo para completar ingresos, ¿no? De un part-time job. En cambio acá es el trabajo principal. Y esto vuelve muy, muy difícil porque al no tener acceso a la seguridad social, al estar trabajando en el mercado negro de perfiles, incluso aquellas compañías que sí tienen seguros de accidentes, pues estos trabajadores no pueden utilizarlos porque al no ser quienes dicen ser en el perfil, pues tampoco están protegidos. Entonces la precariedad del trabajo se vuelve todavía mayor.
What happened? I can't hear you, Maribel.
No, I just finished. Thank
Okay.
you.
So I guess you can raise hands or just unmute yourselves and continue. I see Martin maybe has unmuted himself.
No. Can I would like to ask a question to, if she's still there, to Trine. Are you still there, Trine?
Yes, I am. Yes.
Yeah, it's a double question, really. One is, I mean, I'm really fascinated by this multiple job holder issue, no? And so the way you present it is that the platform work is sort of additional to the main job, no? That's sort of so there the two questions that I have is, one is, what is exactly the motivation of platform workers to do the additional platform work? Is that what I think to understand from the data, that it's to complement relatively low earnings to have a bit better earnings, or is it more like an opportunity to really do better when you already do well? So that's the first question. And the second question is, I agree with Anna when she said that collective bargaining, collective representation may actually be more important for platform workers than, with these additional activities than when it's a main activity. But then the question still remains, how do you do that as a union? How do you represent work that's being done as a small additional activity?
Okay, thank you for the questions. I'll try and see if I can answer them. What I think with the motives, what we're trying to tease out from the data, because we haven't asked explicit in the quantitative data, but we know from what you call qualitative interviews with the platforms, there are different motives at play. Some actually do it in order to pursue an entrepreneurial career. So they see this platform as a stepping stone into becoming, to have some kind of dependence on the platform until they can free themselves and then jump into the startup. A lot of them are using it as a testing playground, some of them as a playground for testing up startup companies. That's not all of them. Then you have the other groups which are topping up, and we can see in the data that a lot of them are also non-standard workers in the traditional labor market. So in that sense, we also see the trends of reinforcing, or in terms of increasing the divide. So they're actually using the platform economy to top up. And also for some of them, it's also a way to get a foothold onto the labor market. Some of these groups wouldn't have a job if they weren't active via the platform for various reasons. Some of them we can see is also on social assistance. And when you come to the capital platform, we see a lot of a small group, but an increasing group of pensioners and what you call older workers. They're leasing out their private properties just to get what we would define as a little bit of champagne to make life sweeter. So that seems to be their motivation, in a sense, what seems to be the case. No. Sorry, I apologize. I have a 8-year-old sitting playing next to me and he thinks it's speaking loud, so I'm sorry about that. In terms of the representation and collective bargaining, it is really important. And actually the unions in Denmark are trying to develop strategies in order what to do about these multiple job holders. And Anna and I are actually conducting a large scale research for one of the main unions in Denmark at the moment to figure out what are the motives and what is it, the needs of these different multiple job holders, because a lot of these groups have patchwork economies and they're very fluctuating income, as we also hear from a lot of the other countries. So we're still exploring that, and the unions even in Denmark are also looking for it. But one of the big things we're also talking about a lot is in terms of representation, because we have examples of unions that have concluded collective agreements. But we also know that a number of these collective agreements, what is the representativeness of this? Because we also know that the union density is very low, if not non-existent. So what is the legitimacy of these type of agreements if you don't have the workers on board? And what types, or who are they actually representing, and whose interest? Is it to protect the insiders, or is it actually also to protect the new groups and emerging groups on the labor market? And I think that could also be tied a little bit to what Kurt was presenting. And I think that's very interesting to be sure.
Thanks. Looking forward to your results.
There is a question in the chat for Julieta. Maybe Julieta, you can read it and respond in Spanish. If you unmute yourself.
Me parece que espero que sea una pregunta retórica, que dice Julieta, punto uno central de la cuestión, cómo repensar los moldes tradicionales en la seguridad social para abordar los trabajos de plataformas, si sirven o no. Aquí a mí en general lo que me gustan son aquellos aportes que piensan que el corazón de la relación laboral estándar está en la protección de los derechos del trabajo, la protección de los derechos de los trabajadores. Y entonces que las protecciones, que la relación laboral estándar tiene que mantener sobre todo esa protección de derechos de los trabajadores y ver cómo las instituciones del trabajo pueden ser maleables o flexibles. Yo no sé si acuerdo personalmente con la idea de que tenemos una arquitectura, un andamiaje protectorio que quedó viejo, sino que pensar cómo bajo esos mismos principios podemos quizás manipular esas en un buen sentido, ¿no? Esas instituciones del trabajo, darle cierta flexibilidad para que sigan pudiendo tener efectividad y proteger a las y los trabajadores, ¿no? Quizás cambiar cuestiones vinculadas con la organización del tiempo del trabajo, dotar a los trabajadores de mayor libertad o soberanía en el uso del tiempo, no va a contramano con las protecciones del trabajo. O sea, presentarlo en esos términos antitéticos, o tenemos una relación laboral estándar con todo el paquete tradicional de horarios fijos y demás, versus la desprotección total, eso es una falacia, y creo que en los marcos institucionales, estos que dice Víctor, de moldes tradicionales de la seguridad social, aún hay espacio para seguir protegiendo a estos trabajadores con características diferentes.
There's also a question from Nicolás Marrero, but not directed to nobody. So what successful union strategies are identified to challenge the notion of the entrepreneurial self? Who wants to take a stab on that one? Maybe Kurt? Just wondering.
Yes. I don't have any specific union strategies in mind. It's got, of course, I would think one of them is that the consequences of the platform work for the worker is not leading to what the workers want. So if there is a kind of contradiction between the discourse of the platform and the experiences of the worker, or even then with the entrepreneurial self-image, then I think then there could be room or opportunities for unions to develop this further, and then to move workers towards an identity towards more of an identity of a genuine worker. So depends on the union, and the union strategy will have to look for those kinds of opportunities in general.
I'm seeing that Trine has answered. In the case of Denmark, we have some union-led freelance bureau, which have managed to assist and protect these groups of workers. Also, we have seen examples of collective agreements for the solo self-employed. I'm just wondering if Tibor has anything to add about union strategies from, well, the East, and then also maybe Julieta from coming more from the Argentinian experience.
Yeah, so in general, for the post-state socialist East, I think the perspectives are quite gloomy, because this was, I think, one of the weak points of unionism in Eastern Europe in general, that they could not fight the so-called atomization of employment. So basically, had a dual labor market, and the one which was pushed more to the precarious informal sectors, that share of workers were also typical, so also not unionized, to the better or the worse. So either, like self-employed, small entrepreneur who is successful less often, or more dependent more often. So, and then it's a very different situation than in many Western European countries, where basically also the government, but also foundations are supporting unions to protect exactly the ones who need more protection, right? To help organizing. And this is, there are no capacities for trade unions to act in this direction. And for Hungary, there are even more alarming news currently. So if you look, for instance, at what happens at the healthcare sector, basically the health workers have now a special employment form. They are not public employees anymore. They cannot strike anymore. They don't have a right to strike. They don't have a right for collective bargaining. And the unions don't know what to suggest to workers, whether to leave altogether even this employment form and based on the labor code, or be self-employed, for instance. So yeah, it's quite gloomy.
May I add something to this?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the view of unions on this the entrepreneurial self is I think has two sides, and one side is that unions first of all work on this notion of when is a person an employee and when is a person not an employee, and in that sense they try to get rid of the, let's say, fake self-employment status. So that is one entry into this discussion. The other entry is that we see, at least in Europe, more and more unions that try to represent self-employed as self-employed. So they are not necessarily against the entrepreneurial side of the self-employed, but they rather try to support groups of self-employed to get out of precarious working conditions. I think that's the one of the trends, at least, that we see, and that is a trend that is not necessarily projected on platform workers, but could be projected also on platform workers.
I'm wondering if Julieta, do you want to answer this about the entrepreneurial self? And then we can probably move towards closing. Yeah.
Sí, una de las cuestiones que en general en las encuestas menos aparecen son las preguntas acerca de cuáles son los elementos positivos y negativos que se ven en estos trabajos. Y siempre hay, en el caso de, por ejemplo, riders, la importancia de ser autónomos y de manejar el propio tiempo, ¿no? Si bien uno eso lo coloca bajo el paraguas de la idea de ser emprendedor de uno mismo, no necesariamente es eso, ¿no? Diferente es el caso quizás que mencionó Anne, que se lo toma como una experiencia para una startup. Ahí sí hay una idea de quiero formar mi propio emprendimiento. Acá tampoco hay como que sobreinterpretar la valoración que se hace del uso del propio tiempo y de la autonomía, que es un anhelo histórico de los trabajadores, con la idea de emprendedurismo, que implica movilizar otros recursos, otro proyecto de vida. Eso me parece también para ir encontrando ciertos matices, y por supuesto que así como hablamos de plataformas de capital y de trabajo, las mismas plataformas de trabajo en línea, fuera de línea, en distintas geografías, hay muchos cruces que hacen a los matices de las experiencias. Yo no quisiera seguir hablando y ya no sé si hay alguna otra reflexión. Preferiría que cerremos más que nada para respetar también el tiempo de Carmelo, de María Victoria, que están haciendo un gran esfuerzo para la traducción, y ya quizás en Europa están por cenar, no sé. No sé cómo estamos con los tiempos.
Yeah. So yeah, I think maybe I would invite everybody to, who wants to put their image on, to just say goodbye, to say thank you very much to Carmelo and Maria Victoria. Thanks to Julieta, Martin, and Jessica for co-organizing this, and to all our speakers and chairs for such an engaging discussion. And I'm really hoping this is not the last one that we have in this, probably more ample formats. Thank you very much. The video will be uploaded in YouTube, and we will share it also with the event participants, of whom we have a record through the Eventbrite. And that's it. Maybe if Martin, Julieta, or Jessica want to say something, if not, thanks very much, and keep in touch, people. Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todos y a todas. Ahí dejé en el chat escrito el nombre de la página de YouTube de la Universidad Metropolitana y del Trabajo, donde vamos a subir, ni bien podamos, el video para compartir. Nuevamente, gracias a todas las instituciones organizadoras, a los expositores, coordinadores y asistentes.
Oh, I'm stopping the recording now.
Okay.
Bye.
Gracias.
Gracias, Juli. Chao.